What if the age of HIV were over? What if everyone made treatment and prevention a priority? If everyone knew their status? If we came together to silence the stigma around HIV? This is what we live for. We live to innovate new therapies, working relentlessly to help people live longer, healthier lives. We stand side by side with the community, educating, advocating, not stopping until everyone is free from HIV. This is what we live for. We live for a day without fear, a day without stigma, the day when HIV is in the past, a day that's getting closer. This is what we live for. For the scientists who make discoveries. We live for everyone with HIV, for everyone who loves them, for the healthcare providers who care for them. All of this is what we live for.
Okay, hi Chris. Thank you
Hi,
so much
Connie.
for joining me today for this World's AIDS Day event. We're going to be doing a intergenerational conversation about AIDS activism, and I'm really excited to be able to talk to you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me on today.
Of course. Do you want to give like a little introduction about where you're at right now?
Sure, I'm Chris Bartlett, he, him, his pronouns. I'm based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I'm the executive director of the William Way LGBT Community Center. And we as a community center are really closely allied with the Bradbury-Sullivan Center in the Lehigh Valley. So we're thrilled to be participating in this great World AIDS Day program that you put together.
Yeah, thank you. That reminded me. My name is Connie Ticho. I am the health programs intern at the Bradbury-Sullivan LGBT Community Center. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I am so excited to have you join us. Let's jump right in. So the first kind of topic question I wanted to talk about was how HIV intersected with your childhood when you kind of first learned about HIV and AIDS. I was born in 1998, so I'm sure my experience was completely different. I know that it was after antiretroviral drugs were accessible to the public, so I know that like that happened a couple years before I was born, so it completely changed the landscape of just like how people were talking about HIV and AIDS. So I was wondering what it was like for you growing up.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was born in 1966. I'm 54 years old now. And when HIV became public, which some people date to this famous New York Times article in June of 1981,
Mhm.
I was 25 years old. No, forgive me, I was 15 years old. See there, I'm adding 10. I was 15 years old in 1981. And, between that time, 1981, and the time you mentioned, 1995, when
Mhm.
antiretrovirals became available, or really effective ones, especially the protease inhibitors, most of us didn't really know what was going to happen in terms of treatments. There were some limited treatments. And in terms of prevention for a number of years, we weren't even really clear how to take care of ourselves. But pretty early on, we learned about safer sex, and we learned that this was spread by a virus. There was a lot of lack of clarity early on about what sort of behaviors put you at risk: sexual behaviors, drug behaviors, and those became clearer as we did community work. And I think a big part of my story is being engaged with other lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people who helped me figure out what I could do, and I helped them figure out what they could do. It was really a community response. So we
Mhm.
educated each other, we read articles, and so there was a lot of uncertainty, like there is with COVID now. Um,
Yeah.
it was somewhat different because it wasn't as infectious, uh, but we didn't know that early on. And as things became clearer, we really had to educate ourselves. And so I was one of the uh, first staffers of the Safeguards Project, which is the gay men's health program. And what we did was exactly that. We brought gay men into the room to say, let's figure this out on our own. And one of my overarching principles of my life of activism is that we can trust people when they're given the best information to make decisions for themselves. They don't have to be imposed upon them. And I think that sort of grassroots sort of organizing is most effective because it counts on the intelligence and wisdom of individuals in conversation with their friends, colleagues, and family to make the best decisions.
Yeah, I love how you've already really talked about or touched upon this idea of like community within activism. Is that how you got started? Like, how did you kind of find your way into AIDS activism? Was that through other community members or?
It's a great question. So I went to college at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. And so I was there in the 80s, from 1984 to 1988, which was really this time I'm talking about where we didn't have a lot of clarity. We were all learning. And, I began to meet friends who were thinking through the same questions I was. I came out at Brown in my junior year. So that would have been 1986. I was 20 years old. And I began in 1987 to hear about this group called ACT UP in New York, who were doing direct action activism. A lot of folks from Brown were going to New York to participate in these meetings. And that got me excited. I was studying Latin and Greek. I was totally, and am still, a total geek. And I was really interested in a geeky way about how we could organize. And I'll say, in terms of gay community, I was reading a great periodical at the time called Gay Community News, which came out of Boston. And it really came at how to be a successful, thriving lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender person through community organizing and through learning from other people. I'll finish the question by saying that I began to explore what that would mean. Like, how could I find other gay men and lesbians? I began reaching out. I was an early guy with email in the 80s. I was totally into that world of figuring out the internet too, which was wasn't totally brand new, but it was pretty new at that moment. And so I was reaching out to other folks and asking questions. And I got involved with the Rhode Island Project AIDS, and we had a hotline where we would answer questions. And I started seeing the effectiveness of community being able to help each other in this way by sharing information and by giving hope, not sharing fear, not sharing anxiety, but sharing hope and sharing actual tools so that people could make the best decisions for themselves and for their households. And so by the time I left Brown in 1988, I went to graduate school to do more Latin and Greek, and I was living in England, and I had to reconnect with new communities there, and I got involved with ACT UP London and doing organizing over there. And by the time I got there, I began to get clear that this is what I want to do with my life, that I wanted to do community building work, and specifically in the light of what was needed around HIV and AIDS, but more broadly than that also.
Thank you for answering. I liked what you touched upon, like coming together as a community to talk about hope versus fear. Like, I can't imagine how much fear there was during all the confusion that was going on when the AIDS epidemic really came into light. And I wanted to know what it was kind of like when you were doing activism within the LGBTQ plus community, when LGBTQ plus issues weren't mainstream. Not that they're super normalized today, but I feel like, they are more mainstream today. So what was it like when it was very stigmatized, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it was different. And I have to remind myself of that. We used to have a gay history week at Brown every year, and we would set up a pink triangle, which was one of the political symbols of gay solidarity. And every year the fraternities would come out and destroy the pink triangle. And we learned that we had to protect it. And we would stay up all night and protect this pink triangle. And I just remember thinking, why would people have so much hate if they feel like they have to do that? And I think that in conversation with people, and including some of these homophobic guys who I got to know interacting, was that, that their reactions stem from fear too, and a lack of understanding of gender, and a lack of understanding of sexuality, and a type of masculinity that they felt meant they had to be opposed to what we stood for.
Yeah.
And so one of the things we did was we created these teams of people who would go out into the dorms and talk about what it meant for us to be gay and lesbian. At that time, the words we used were just lesbian, gay. We didn't even include bisexual and transgender, which is horrible in retrospect. But at the time, those tended to be the two words that were used. And so we would go out and speak in the dorms, and people would get really angry with us. Some people were supportive, but it
Mhm.
was a completely different time. And I think that what I learned was that what Harvey Milk said is really true. Harvey Milk, who was the San Francisco supervisor, was assassinated in 1978, so not too much earlier than this time I'm talking about. And he said that it's really important to come out. And I think that's not just true of coming out as being gay. It means coming out as being trans. It means coming out as having any sort of chronic disease. The power that comes from being honest and living in your truth, that helps to reduce fear and anxiety around other people. And I think the story of the last 30 years since then has been about an incredible movement of LGBT people who've done exactly that. We've come out not only with pride, but we've shown the way that we're intrinsic to American culture as a whole. Like, American culture could not survive without the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender brains who helped to fuel it.
Yeah.
And so that, I think, has been the big transformation in the last 30 years, that now people realize when if we decide to shut everything down, everything would shut down. Hollywood would shut down, the hospitals would shut down, the colleges and universities and high schools would shut down. And so people are aware of that now. And the reason is that every person, even if they're homophobic or transphobic, knows at least one gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender person in their network. And sometimes that personal relationship isn't enough to overcome the homophobia or transphobia or biphobia, but oftentimes it is. When they get to connect with the humanity of another person, it can be transformational.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, just like thinking about what you were talking about in your college experience, it's so important for me to hear as someone who went to college and just was like met with so many other queer people. That idea of having to like go talk to people about your identity and having like homophobic remarks made back to you is just really interesting. I think a lot of people in my generation or that I've talked to experience more like internalized homophobia. And so it's really, I don't know, it's also just so important, I feel like, for my generation to hear your generation like talk about those small acts, or that took a lot of strength and courage to like go talk to people, to hear about how you had to do that. Makes me feel very grateful for where we're at now, even though there's so much more to do. Going back to ACT UP, I know that ACT UP activism was very direct. I would love to hear more just about your experience in ACT UP. I know you were in ACT UP Philadelphia, I believe, in the 1990s.
That's right.
Yeah, so I'd love to hear more about that, and maybe about how I feel like LGBTQ plus activism looks a bit different today, not just because of COVID, but I think also just because of like the internet. And maybe you could talk about some things that you think current activists could kind of implement from what you did when you were in ACT UP.
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that somebody told me once, which I found to be really true, is that the activism you do in your 20s, your late teens, early 20s, tends to be a foundation for the rest of your life. And that's really true for me. Like, I was so lucky I landed in ACT UP Philadelphia, because in that organization, there were men and women who had been part of transformational movements prior to that. The feminist movement, the pro-choice movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the Black Civil Rights movement, the environmental justice movement. I could go on and on. There were literally folks from all those movements who were a generation or two generations older than me, who had learned the lessons of all those movements and were bringing them to ACT UP and saying, you know, here's what we have to do. We've done it in other movements. Here's how to do it. And so I got trained by these elders who, really had an esteemed role in my early activism and very formational in how I think about things. This idea of what was then called liberation, it's now called intersectionality, but it's the same thing, that movements are intersectional. And, you know, I found it's really recharging and energizing. Like ACT UP, they would say, all right, we're going to do clinic defense today. It wasn't even like you were asked for permission. You're just going to do clinic defense. And we would go to an abortion clinic and defend it so that women could get access to healthcare. Mm-hmm. And we would show up to do prison outreach to people living with HIV in the prisons, or we would show up at environmental justice demonstrations. And I remember one big demonstration, and 1992, where we were outside the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia, protesting President George Bush the first. I don't know if people even remember him, but there was a first George Bush, and we were protesting him. And there were people there from the unions, there were environmental justice, pro-choice, LGBT, HIV activism, all in one place. And to me, the feeling of the power that there were thousands of people there, if it had just been the AIDS activists, it wouldn't have been enough. But with all of us together, I actually believe that demonstration had a role in the fact that Bush was not reelected for a second term, due to a number of strategic things that arose from that. And so I learned early on the importance of solidarity with other movements, educating yourself about other movements, just going to demonstrations for things you know nothing about, just showing up and learning about them. Because I think if you just stay focused in one movement, you can end up getting jaded, cynical, exhausted, and burned out really easily. Whereas if suddenly you show up in a totally different activist milieu, you can get charged by that and energized by it. And I have to remind myself of that now, because like the Black Lives Matters movement's so invigorating for me. And because of COVID, I haven't felt comfortable actually going to demonstrations, but I'm doing what I can remotely to support those demonstrations. I'm educating myself about them, mm-hmm. and learning so much. And it relates to a final thing I want to say that I learned there in ACT UP Philadelphia in the early 90s was that value of intergenerational activism. Because I think that youth play a really critical role in activism, because when we're youth, at that point in our life when we identify that way, we are not constrained by the boxes and ways of thinking of past generations. We come in and we're like, all right, I know that's the way you used to think about pronouns, but here's how we're thinking about pronouns now, and we're going to make this shift. And the older generations they either have to learn, which is the right thing to do, or they can become resistant and bitter, which in my opinion is the wrong thing to do. So the youth bring all this energy, and that's what happened in ACT UP. There was all this activist young energy that was like, we're going to fight this, and we're not going to be ashamed to be gay. We're in fact going to be in their faces about being gay or lesbian. And so, it was such an exciting room to be in, where you had all these people who just wanted to go out, and I'll say that a big part about it is there were people in the room who were dying, literally people who within 2 weeks or a month or sometimes a year would die. And so we had a sense of urgency, like we were fighting for Dominic, and maybe he would only live for another year. We were fighting for Kiyoshi, who might live for another 10 years, but we didn't know that. And so, there was a real sense that we could do anything because it was life and death. And I think we see something similar with the Black Lives Matters movement, that this really is life and death, and has been. The need to confront white supremacy has been a life and death issue. So that's where the intersectionality of movements is really important, where we can learn from each other and fight for each other, like show up for each other, is really important.
Wow, you said so many things that I was like, oh, I want to touch upon that. I feel like people my age or in my generation, like it was interesting to hear you talk about this word liberation and now how it kind of translates to intersectionality. I feel like a lot of people my age kind of act like we have created that word, or like don't really acknowledge that, like, no, this was like a part of activism before us. And it sounds like with ACT UP, it's like it wasn't even a choice. Like the whole like organization understood the important, like how important it is to be a part of different movements. I know personally, I always think of that like poem that's like, first they came for these people, and then they came for these people, and then they came for me and no one was left. And for me, that's like, yeah, it's like we're all part of one community when it comes down to it, right? So we have to stand up for every like group. That's just my own thinking on that. But
that's
I just
exactly
love,
right.
Yeah, I love what you said about like how in ACT UP you would go to environmental protests, or you were going to abortion clinics. And yeah, wow, that's awesome. I didn't know that about ACT UP. And I think that in my generation, we really are like, at least the people I'm interacting with are very energetic, like really want to like get in there with our new ideas. But you're right, like it's so important that we also like take a moment and like learn from the activists who came before us, and to, understand those tactics. I think that, I don't know, I think sometimes I do see like the idea of intersectionality being lost within activism, just like I see people getting hyper focused on one movement. And so it's just really neat and special to hear you talk about like being an AIDS activist, but also just like how much it seeped into other movements. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm, like I said, I'm grateful that I had these tremendous mentors who were like, all right, you're a man, you need to step back and let the women have a voice here. Or you're a white person, you need to step back. Like I had people who said that to me early on. And I won't say I was perfect in it. I still have, as a white person, I have racist qualities. As a guy, I have sexist qualities. But I was really pushed to challenge them early on, and lucky to have mentors who were there to sort of hold me accountable. And so one of the things I always say when I'm out speaking to folks organizing is find a mentor. You don't even have to ask permission, just find a mentor and then mentor people. Like do it in both directions. It's a two-way street. And it has nothing to do with age. Like younger people can mentor older people. Like I treasure the younger people in my life who are mentoring me. Because like I said, they have a whole new perspective on the world that just because I was born 40 years before them, I can't. And so I really strive to find mentors of all ages who can help me understand that perspective. And a lot of times that means stepping back. I think sometimes elders make the mistake of putting themselves on a pedestal and feeling like they deserve a certain level of respect just because they're older. And I don't think that ever works. I think when there's something separate from age that has to do with, here's my experience, I want to offer it to you, but I'm really interested in your experience too. Mm-hmm. And it becomes a two-way street. It loses the hierarchy, it loses the power dynamic, and it becomes a mutual relationship that can actually empower both people. And I think a large part of the reason that I've had burnouts over the course of my career, for sure. I've had moments where like I'm done. But the reason I was able to come back is because I had this networking community of people who believed in me, both older and younger, who sort of came back and said, all right, we know you're tired, but you're coming along anyway. You're going to come help us with this. And likewise, I played that role for others. When I see them tired, we can give people a chance to take a break and have a rest and have them come back. And I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think you mentioned like having mentors of all different ages, and you not being able to understand things just because of like being in different generations. I think it's so important for people in my generation to remember to listen to older people, because I think sometimes they're like, well, my ideas are so new and like I'm so ready, and it's, yeah, I think we have to like really pause and be like, no, we should also make sure to include like people who've been around in activism for a while. Like I don't think there's necessarily something that like queer people who are in my generation, we haven't gone through something like the AIDS epidemic, like thank God, that was, so big and just so, what I imagine, so scary. And I feel like we can learn so much from people who were doing activism during that time. And I don't think I fully realized how much I could learn. And I'm sure I'm not alone in that. So yeah, also, I read your chapter in Body and Barriers, and I know that you mentioned talking about like educating future generations of like the queer community, but you kind of had spoke upon this idea of like, that I found really interesting, I never thought about, was how like within the queer community, it's not your family that's necessarily in the community to like teach you. So it's not like I have parents who aren't in the LGBTQ community, so it's not like they can necessarily sit me down and tell me the history. And my dad has worked a lot within HIV testing, so he was able to like talk to me a lot about HIV and the AIDS epidemic growing up, and I knew about it from a very young age, but it still was from a very different lens because it wasn't coming from my community. And when I was reading your words talking about how like it's not a community that has these like blood familial ties, I was like, oh yeah, like of course. And I had never thought about that. So that being said, how do you think older generations of queer people can really tell younger generations about the history of loss and the history of strength of the LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah, I think it's that's such a great question. gave me goosebumps just thinking about it. But I mean, one of the things that I don't know if I mentioned in that article, but I do have a gay dad, which was, you know, a remarkable part of my story, because I did have a blood person in my life who could, you know, he was one of the first persons who talked to me about safer sex, for example, in the 80s, and was like, you have to take care of yourself. And when I think of how lucky I was to have that, but I think I then learned, like, well, for a lot of people, we have to create that for ourselves. We have to create our own queer families. And I do think people should think about that. And we have a lot to learn from Black LGBT folks, for example, in the Vogue houses, where people choose their mother, people choose their children. And when they refer to someone as "that's my child," it's serious. It's like, it's a real accountability. And so we do have the ability to create those families, and we actually have models within queer communities of what it looks like. And I definitely see it in trans communities, where older generations of trans men and women take a direct interest in younger generations and invest in them. And again, it is a two-way street. They learn from each other. So I think we're really good at creating these families of choice. And it's a direct challenge to the right-wing idea of family, you know, which is very selfish. It's just about your little family and only caring about the family within your house. Queer families are much broader than that, and they're geographic, and they extend generationally, and they're not within just one race or one class or one sex or gender identity. Like, my queer family has folks from all of those identities, and I've really worked hard to cultivate it, because I always say the natural way in life is to end up around people who are like you, whatever that means. So whoever you are, whatever your self-identity is, if you don't work at it, you're going to end up mostly around people like that. And it actually requires a conscious attempt to create a queer family that is more inclusive than that. And I think another one of the lucky things that happened to me when I came back to Philly, I attended a lecture by George Lakey, who particularly spoke about organizing over class. And he said to work cross-class, personal relationships are really important. Like, if you cultivate those, you can get across political difference. And so I spent a lot of time, and still do, having lunches with people, breakfasts, being really interested in their personal lives, so that, as always happens, you have a political fight over something, but you can weather that when you have a really strong relationship. And that's part of what the queer family looks like, that, you know, you may have a disagreement with this person, but in the end, they're going to have your back. And now more than ever, we need that. And we learned that during Trump, like whatever advances and significant advances we made during the Obama administration, and they were very significant, that many of them were retracted in the Trump administration, and particularly for trans and gender nonconforming people. And so we can't let down our guard. And, you know, I feel like we've learned this. I always look at Jewish communities for one of our models. Like Jews, even when they're apparently accepted, anti-Semitism is lurking there right in the background. And sometime like now, it's right in the foreground.
Yeah.
So, you know, Jews can't just decide, I'm going to disappear from the Jewish community. They know. They have enough history. And I think we as queers have enough history to know we can't depend on the right-wing model, which is just to stick with your blood family very selfishly and not care about anyone else. We need to have a very broad communitarian philosophy where the other folks in our communities, even the ones who don't look like us, who don't share our gender identity, or of a different class, they are part of our extended queer family. And my point of view, we have a responsibility and accountability to them, especially the ones who are treated most oppressively by whatever political force is in power.
Yeah, I mean, just while you were speaking, I was like thinking about my queer family, and I love how you talked about how we're having a discussion about activism, and like the word active is in that, and how you have to be active in making, like, you're choosing your queer family, and being responsible for, you know, the most marginalized in our community. I think that is something important that I'm happy from what I'm seeing of the people I interact with in my generation. Like, I think my queer friends and my queer family really get that, like, this is a bigger community. It's not just about people who look like you or have those same exact identities or those same sexual orientations as you. It's about the community as a whole. Like, I love that quote that's like, we're not free until we're all free. And I totally think about that just in regards about like the queer community. And I try to implement that into my own activism. I wonder what it is like for you when you see younger generations of queer folks who kind of ignore safe sex protocol or ignore PrEP and PEP or don't take it as regularly as they should be. Like, what kind of response does that bring up for you?
I might have an unexpected response on this one. I don't know. Maybe you had no expectation, but I I think that young people are at start rebellious. It's part of who young people are, like rebellious towards parents, rebellious towards teachers. And there's an interesting public health phenomenon called resistance to public health. So if you tell me not to smoke, I'm going to smoke. If you tell me to have safer sex, I'm going to have sex without a condom. So there's a documented phenomenon. And I think when, as a queer person, you've been told that you're wrong your whole life, you're suspicious of any message that tells you you're wrong. And so I know in the safer sex education we did in the 90s, we tried really hard not to make people wrong. And so that meant not saying, that use a condom every time. We never said that. We imagined there's some people who might not want to use a condom for various reasons. And then how can they do that to protect themselves as much as possible? Harm reduction, it's called nowadays, people may decide to use injection drugs. How can we protect them as much as possible by providing them with clean needles? And so it's kind of a difference between an abstinence approach and a harm reduction approach. And as somebody who's been involved in both of those approaches, there are strengths to both. But I think particularly with queer people, harm reduction tends to work better because we're rebellious and we're suspicious of authority, because authority has been homophobic and authority's been transphobic and authority's been sexist.
Yeah.
So I think that you have to balance giving people the best information. For example, in the case of COVID, wearing a mask, you're definitely going to be safer than if you don't. But if you are a rebellious person who's not wearing a mask, here's some other things you can do. And I think the complication that gets involved in the communitarian aspect of that, that you potentially put other people at risk. And we do have to remind people of that we're part of a community and we're responsible not just for our own health, but for the health of a whole community. And that's why, both Bradbury-Sullivan and William Way are involved in tobacco education and reminding people that smoking doesn't just impact us, it impacts our whole community and our family. And so likewise, with both safer sex and COVID prevention, I feel like it's having the sort of conversation that empowers people to choose for themselves to live the healthiest life they're able to live. And so, one of the things that's being explored is like, if you're in recovery, you've just stopped using a heroin or methamphetamines and you smoke, and smoking is the thing that helps you a little bit with your stress at this time. It may be some time before you give up smoking, but a lot of the same principles apply of helping people to envision the healthiest life for them possible, and not only for them, but for their family and friends and the folks who are around them. So it's a long answer to say that I've always been resistant to any approach that tells people to stop doing things, because I think it has a counterproductive effect with people who are rebellious by nature.
I don't think I had much of an expectation, but that was definitely not what I was expecting. But that answer was very, wow, I agree. I didn't know what you were going to say, but I definitely agree with everything you just said.
I'll say one more thing, because sometimes people expect the answer to be like, I lived through the AIDS epidemic, and these young kids who aren't using condoms, like that sort of grumpy geezer kind of voice. And I know that when I was in my 20s, grumpy geezer didn't work for me. So, I'm really intent upon not being a grumpy geezer. I could be at times. There are moments when I'm like, I can't believe that person is doing X, Y, or Z thing. But then when I take a step back, I think, what do I not know about their lives? Why might they need compassion in this moment as opposed to a judgmental attitude? And if I get to compassion, I can usually be a much more supportive advocate for them than if I'm the grumpy geezer.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. You touched upon COVID, and read some articles about people who are living with HIV or by AIDS activists who talk about how COVID has brought up some feelings regarding like AIDS epidemic. I was wondering what lessons maybe you think that activists learned during the AIDS epidemic that could be implemented during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, well, the cool thing is that a lot of the AIDS activists who were involved with me in ACT UP are already at work on all this thinking through Treatment Action Group and many of the groups who specifically were organized to think about how do we get the best treatments for people, but also how do we create communities where people feel supported. So I think a large part of this is thinking about how we can engage with people in community and have them involved and supported, and so that they don't feel abandoned and isolated. And I'm really proud that we put infrastructure in place back in the 90s that has allowed us to be ready for this moment, in a really powerful way.
Yeah, I know for me, like, it's been really just like having that community base like during the COVID-19 pandemic has been so important. And like working at the Bradbury-Sullivan Community Center, like seeing how much we are, I don't know, like doing outreach within our own community and within the queer community has been really important for me as like a person in their young 20s and someone who, you know, I think I'm an activist. Like sometimes I don't know if I can take that label. But it's just been really important, I think, for me during this time to like see how much the queer community can come together to build a community and lift each other up. And I feel like I read a lot about that happening during the AIDS epidemic and during AIDS activism. So it is neat to, for me at least, to see that kind of mirrored during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, and I think it's the difference is and I've talked to many of my fellow activists of my generation. The difference is we can't be together in the same room. And that is a big difference. And so I think the greatest minds of the movement right now are thinking about how do we build solidarity, mutual concern, mutual support at a time that we may not be able to be in the same room with people. And I think there's a solution. We all know Zoom isn't perfect and most people are annoyed by it in some way, but it's much better than nothing.
Yeah.
And I think we are over the next year, and this is likely to last for another year in significant ways and then less significant ways after that, that we're going to see innovations for how we can be present for each other in really powerful ways when we may not be in a room, or that maybe there's going to be new architectural structures that allow us to be together in safe ways. Like I'm imagining all of that because I know from experience how powerful it is to be in the same room with somebody, like the difference that makes. And so that people can look you in the eye, which you can do in Zoom, but it's not quite the same as knowing the person's right there. And when they say that they're going to be there for you, they actually are right there for you. So I think this is the big difference between COVID and HIV. And we have to be thinking about really innovative ways to create that community of mutual support.
Yeah, I love the word queer in general, but I love using it as a verb and like thinking about the idea of like queering activism as just like doing activism now in non-normative ways. So I'm definitely in the same boat thinking. I enjoy thinking about all those things. I know that like remembrance has been a big part of, I don't want to say your story, but I know that you made a wiki catalog of all the gay men who had died in Philadelphia. So what do you personally feel is the power of remembrance? Like, why do you find that so important for future generations?
Yeah, I think it's been a theme throughout my whole life, of being really interested in history and remembering what came before. Part of it is I had an awesome grandmother who had played a really important role in my life. And she always basically was like, respect your elders. But she said it in a way that I could actually hear it. And it was kind of like, come meet all my cool friends and you're going to want to hang around them too. So early on, I became the family genealogist. I was really interested in my family history. And I realized I could understand myself much better when I understood my grandparents and great-grandparents and where we came from and all the traumas we'd gone through and all those stories. So I thought it probably applies to community in general. And so I've become a genealogist of queer communities, like understanding where we come from. And I was just thinking today, I was reading a writer named John Preston, who was a a gay man who died of AIDS in 1994. Fantastic writer. And it turns out he was the mentor of my mentor, who was a guy named Eric Rothfuss. And so I'm reading this biography of John Preston, and I'm recognizing so much about Eric, my mentor, in John's story. And I'm recognizing so much of myself. And I realized that John's story got passed down to Eric, it got passed down to me. And so I feel like all of us should choose this genealogy. And it doesn't have to even be people we know, but it could be like, Socrates is in my intellectual genealogy, a gay man from ancient Greece. People will question whether you can apply the word gay, but I'm going to do it anyway. Or Sappho is part of my lesbian heritage. And there are incredible stories of trans heritage that people could claim. And I think it's important as queer people that we create these genealogies for ourselves. Think about, I know your colleague, Adrian Schenker, his grandfather was a famous union organizer. That's a real genealogy that he can claim. And I'm sure some of his passion got passed down through his family. So when we think of these queer families, which are more virtual, they're thinkers that we met, and it could even be like a sexual partner who really inspired us. Like queer lives are so diverse and exciting that we can claim it in different ways. So that's why I find it important to remember, because I want to know all those stories of LGBT people who came before me, and I want to celebrate them, both so that I know them on a deep level, but so I can pass those stories on to the next generation, so they don't have to search for them as much as I had to search for them. And I'm grateful for the queer mentors who shared their stories with me, or like, you need to understand about this person. Judy Garland, you know who Judy Garland was? Like Ethel Merman. For younger folks who don't know, Ethel Merman was just this really brassy singer. She wasn't even a lesbian, but she's sort of part of this show tune, campy culture that's part of my genealogy. And so I really celebrated her. So I think it's really important. And we've learned this from African-American communities, the importance of understanding that genealogy. And we've learned it from Jews. One of the stories I always tell that got me into remembrance is that I was reading about the post-Holocaust reaction, and somebody said, we're never going to forget a single Jew who was murdered. And they began creating these books that would list all the Jews who lived in a particular town who'd been murdered. And I thought, we've never done that with HIV. We lost thousands of people, but we've never documented every single one of them. And that was my commitment to do the Gay History Wiki within Philadelphia, to document every single person I could find. But I think it should be a national project, because frankly, the men and women who died of AIDS, for a lot of reasons, they were risk takers. They were many times incredibly creative people. They were very important parts of community organizing. Mm-hmm. And so to forget their stories, I think, is a tremendous loss. It may force us to relive a piece of history we didn't need to relive if we knew that. So that's why, to me, remembrance is so important. And I'll just mention that right now we're doing a new project at William Way, which is to ask the men and women who lived through those years before the protease inhibitors, between 81 and 94, to tell the stories of one person they lost to HIV, just to remember that one person. And out of that, we're going to write a play that tells the story of all those collected histories. And we're going to do a funeral, because not all of them got the funeral or the acknowledgement that they deserved at that time. So obviously this is something I'm really passionate about. Yeah. And I hope it gets, I know that there are trans advocates and gender nonconforming advocates who share this point of view. And I want to get behind that effort, because I just know that there are historical stories that are so powerful and inspiring, like Joan of Arc as, definitely a gender nonconforming person who was incredibly bold, for example. And there are just thousands of examples like that just have to be dug up from history. And we're allowed to reclaim them and tell them the way we want. I really believe in that we don't have to tell the stories the way straight people have told them for years. We can tell them our own ways.
Wow. Yeah. That was very powerful for me. Growing up was always very aware of my own Jewish heritage and the history and how that played into my life, right? But I don't feel like, I talked earlier about how LGBTQ issues are a bit more mainstream now, right? But still growing up, I didn't feel like I, had a strong connection to the queer community, and I didn't feel like I could claim those histories as part of my own history. And just hear you talking about this lineage and the idea of like, I don't know, I don't think anyone has ever told me like, oh, you can claim these like historical LGBTQ figures as like your ancestors in a way, and like as you're one of the people who are continuing on their legacy. And I don't know, to hear you kind of to tell me that and to just hear you talk about that was very, I was like getting emotional. It felt felt very powerful. Um,
So
I don't,
glad.
yeah, and I don't know how many people my generation, feel, that way. And I think even looking at people like younger than me, it's like amazing to see how much, I don't know. It's like I'm 22, but when I see like 15-year-olds who are now like coming out and finding connections within the queer community, I think that's like so beautiful and like crazy. And it'll be so interesting when I'm like an activist in my 30s and they're in their 20s, and kind of to like, see all these like new generations constantly happening, which I imagine for you, you've seen over and over again multiple times now.
Yeah, and I want people to be rooted. I think it's so important. Like, I think in the excitement of being young, and I remember it myself, the excitement of being young and doing revolutionary work. I mean, the work that's being done by trans and gender nonconforming people, by activists, I revere them as my mentors right now, because I feel like, you know, the the strategies that are being used to challenge the way we think about gender, to challenge the way we think about sexuality, that nothing's binary, that in fact there's an infinite number of shades between the so-called poles, and that some people don't identify with the category at all. And how cool, like that we can actually liberate ourselves to think in that new way. And so I want to find a way both to help my generation of queer people not be resistant to that,
Mm-hmm.
because it's part of the role of elders to be like, oh my God, I can't believe this new thing they're doing. Like that's been around forever. But I think the most effective elders are the ones who like embrace it and are like, yes, challenge us to see this in a new way. And I feel like the major role of queer people in society is to maximize difference. So the role of conservatives is to minimize difference and have everyone look the same and assimilate and act the same. The role of queers is to maximize difference. And so I always say, if we have 3 identities this year, next year we're going to have 10, and 2 years from now we're going to have 100. And that's great. It's really great in that it allows people to explore, like, I want to be this way now, and maybe next year I'm going to be different, and that's okay too. I identify as gender nonconforming now, I change my mind. I identify as bi now, I change my mind, or vice versa. I'm actually bi. How liberating that we create a world where people can both be experimental and try out new things and not feel boxed in by one identity. And the challenge, I think, this is the real challenge I'm focusing is how to build solidarity amongst all that difference.
Yeah.
So instead of viewing another identity as your opponent, or maybe not cool enough, or maybe old fashioned, or maybe too new fashions, that we have to do everything we can to build solidarity. And I think probably at age 54, that's what I put most of my energy into, is to constantly reaching out to people and establishing relationships, again, coming back to what I said earlier, so that when we have political differences, because I'm a cis white gay man, that's a category, that's a thing, cis white gay man. So people may view me with whatever that means that for them.
Yeah.
And so I want to present myself as, whatever you think about cis white gay man, I'm not that cis white gay man, I'm my own. And come take a chance to get to know me, and I'll do the same with you. And I feel like that's what we need right now in a very divisive point in American history.
Mm-hmm.
People to have the courage to be like, I don't really like cis white gay men, but I'm going to take a chance and meet Chris anyway. And we'll have lunch a couple times. And oh, wow, he's not as bad as I expected him to be, right? And vice versa for me, to take a risk in meeting some people who maybe I was uncomfortable with, and discovering that they're not exactly what I expected to be. And I realize that I'll finish the point with this, that there are some people are just unsafe with, because of their history, that white men played a certain role in their oppression or were violent towards them. They just don't want to be around white men. I understand that. Like, I'm not saying that every category of person has to be for every person, but that all of us should challenge ourselves to be in a slight place of discomfort, whatever that is.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the liberation is.
Yeah. Wow. I was gonna ask if you had any like words of advice, I mean, this whole time you've been giving advice, but if you had any like really specific words of advice for younger activists, whether they're fighting, still fighting for, still fighting like AIDS activism, or if they're advocating for trans lives or for Black lives, do you have any like any more advice, or any like kind of like something that you keep in your back pocket that you like, this is a piece of advice I have?
Yeah, I think the overarching principle for me is love. I love everyone. I even love the people that I strongly am opposed to. Like, that's how I come at the world. I don't mean love like I necessarily like them, but I mean love that, like, I have compassion for
Yeah.
whatever made them into the human being they are. And so I think it's really important to reach the point where you can love your fellow activists. And I love the Emma Goldman quote where she said, if you can't dance, it's not my revolution. Like, for me, so many of the parts of my revolution were dancing with fellow, literally on the dance floor, having fun. This was before I got into recovery, getting drunk, doing all kinds of crazy things that I did when I was in my 20s and sometimes still do now. But like, being in community with my fellow activists and having fun with them. Because if all you do is the work and all you do is the very serious political stuff, and it is very serious and it is very life and death, but if you can't dance, there's no way the revolution is going to sustain itself. So that's my, like, and it's really hard during COVID. How do we have fun now?
Yeah.
I was in a Zoom room the other day where somebody set up this really fun game that involved like turning off your cameras, and there was the Hollywood squares going on the screen. I was like, this is really fun. Like, I do think we're going to find ways to make this fun, but we're only 6 months into it, and it requires a lot of innovation. Like, I'm hanging out on TikTok a lot. TikTok is so much fun. And I think part of it is, it's like a really small snapshot into people's lives.
Yeah.
Really, from the very bizarre to the super boring. And I like all of it. Like, I want to see Italian grandmas making sauce. And I want to see people jumping off of cliffs, like, and everything in between. So TikTok is one of the places I go to really have fun. And I'm trying to get up the courage to actually do my own first video, because I feel a little bit like grandpa coming into the youthful thing.
Do it. You got it.
I know there's a lot of older people on TikTok. I know that. I'm overcoming my own fear around like feeling humiliated, or people, all the stuff you go through until you just do it. And then you're like, I'm so glad I did that. So, but I know there's a community on TikTok that's super engaged. Like, people do care for each other.
Yeah.
Somebody expresses suicidal thoughts, people jump into the comments and are supportive, try to plug them into support. So to me, TikTok is one of the exciting places. And I will say, in general, I've been an early adopter. I was a very early adopter of Twitter. And what I loved about Twitter is, suddenly, through hashtags, I had connections to people all over the world who there's no other way I could have met them. But suddenly they're doing hashtag gay elder. And I know all the people around the United States who are interested in gay elders. So I found that technology, on the one hand, can be really helpful. On the other hand, it can be very isolating.
Yeah.
And I have been thinking about stepping off of Facebook for a while, because I find the tone of the politics to be non-solidarity, non-love on the whole. Whereas on TikTok, I feel the love more. And I'm not sure that those are fair characteristics of either of the platforms, but I think my recommendation is to be curious as an activist, to maintain curiosity. They talk about the childlike gaze as one of the Buddhist ideas, to go through life with a childlike gaze, to never let them beat that out of you. Like, society wants to beat your childlike wonder out of you, either through your job or through tedious things that they throw at you in life. And I've got my fair share of those, but I've worked hard not to let society beat the childlike wonder out of me, so that I can be like, wow, gender nonconforming pronouns, cool. I want to like totally learn all about that. Or, Black Lives Matter. I want to like meet the folks who are doing that activism and see how I can engage. Like, I come at all of it with wonder, and as opposed to the opposite, which would be like, that's not like me. I'm not having anything to do with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think coming at things with just compassion and love, and I don't know, coming at it with understanding, or like taking a pause to like just ignore your preconceived ideas is really important.
It's so corny that it's got to be true.
Yeah.
That's how I'm feeling about it. It's like love. I do think, and many of the elder activists who I esteem have gotten to this point where it's all about love in the end. And we all go through points where I can't love that person. Like, I cannot. But I think the people who do not burn out, I think the reason people burn out is because the hate takes over or the divisiveness takes over. And you just can't live in that for
Yeah.
an extended period of time. It takes you down. And so, and sometimes people point to, like Malcolm X, who I'm a huge fan of, his activism, like people somehow think that his activism was less loving than Martin Luther King. I don't think so. I think Malcolm X actually really was about love,
Yeah.
and really teaching Black folks what it was like to love each other and love
Yeah, I
themselves.
agree.
And with the Black gay men's movement, there was this famous quote: "Black men loving Black men is the revolutionary act." So, like, what a great quote. Like, there's
Mhm.
no more revolutionary act than Black men loving each other.
Yeah.
And so, to me, a lot of those fundamental ideas come back to love,
Yeah.
and avoiding the natural desire to make somebody else worthy of hatred.
Yeah, wow. Thank you. Thank you for everything you said. I really think this World AIDS Day, like, I'm just gonna really, remember that, like, the revolution and the activism that my generation, my friends, my family, and I are doing. Um, and I always try to remember this in general. It's just we are continuing on what was already started. This isn't something new, like the activism that I'm doing. It's like just a progression on what like your generation started and what the generations before you started. And I think, you said it and just echoing it, like it's so important to have that root and to remember that. And I think, looking back at AIDS activism, I can really find, those roots.
I'll be really curious to hear your list. I just reminded me, I have a voicemail waiting for me from Barbara Giddings, not from Barbara Giddings, from Kayla Housen, who's the wife of Barbara Giddings. So Kayla Housen is 90 something now, and she was one of the founding lesbians of queer liberation in Philadelphia and the United States. She was the photographer of queer liberation, and she's still my friend. And
Cool.
she's an example of a 91-year-old woman who is genuinely interested in my life and stays involved in my life. And I want to be that person when I'm 91 to a younger generation. And so she's part of my genealogy for sure. And I'll leave us all with that thought, that the more diverse the genealogy, the better. And this is just a fun game I play. It's not scientifically valid, but I love to look at my Facebook friends, like pull up my Facebook friends list and think about who's missing from that list or who's underrepresented. And really think in terms of specific measurable results about how I'm going to grow my network. So is my network too old? Is my network too white? Is it too male? And the answer is almost always yes to all three of those. But when I'm in a good place of my life, I'm growing in the direction of more women, fewer white people, more queer people of diverse queernesses.
Yeah.
People from geographies, like how many people from Idaho? You can do this on Facebook. You can pull up all your friends from Idaho in your friends list. And you should probably have a couple friends from Idaho to understand their world,
Yeah. Yeah, I just want to say, like, again, thank you so much for coming to chat with me. This has been really special and very wonderful for me.
Yeah, total pleasure for me too, Connie. So nice to meet you. And look forward to, like I said, that we get to do it in person in Allentown at some point.
Yes. Yeah. Next year in person.
Yes. Next year in Allentown.
Thank
Take
you.
care.